Welcome to the Adelaide Property Quarterly Market Update with Marissa Schultz from Rise High and Lockie Turner from Turner Real Estate. We're here today to bring you a quarterly market update, specifically focusing on the Adelaide property market, and definitely been an eventful quarter, hasn't it, Lockie?
Yes, it has. Really, out of the two capital cities in Australia, Brisbane and Adelaide have been the two that have maintained excellent numbers in terms of where the values of houses are going. So most of the eastern seaboard states really started to slow at to the start of this year, but Adelaide and Brisbane have still been really strong.
Absolutely. I saw the stats actually the other day that during the March quarter, the Adelaide property value growth outperformed any other capital city in the country, which is awesome.
Right,
so Adelaide is now leading the space in terms of the growth, and Adelaide had a growth of another 2% in the March quarter, and that brings us up to about 27% over the last 12 months, which is pretty amazing for those of you that have had property and bought before that growth happened. But definitely, like you said, it seems there is a bit of flatness now on the eastern seaboard, Sydney and Melbourne, but do you still see that there's future growth ahead for Adelaide?
Well, it might come back, because no one really knows, of course, I suppose, but it might come back to more historical averages, which are about 3% a year, and not up around, the 15% mark and the 10% mark. So I think this sort of news is welcome for people that don't own a property and for buyers that want to get into the market, especially first-home buyers. So it is an opportunity, and maybe the tables are going to turn a little bit. But I think the values that the properties have now have in them from the growth of almost 30%, which is extraordinary in such a short time. I think that growth will stay in the properties, especially in Adelaide. Adelaide is a very much steady as she goes city and has been always, and that's actually why investors love Adelaide, because it does not have the volatility. It's not like a share market. You don't have to sort of buy and sell and really watch it super closely. Generally, it is fairly even. And one would argue that the prices that we've had in the Adelaide market nearing on the 30% mark were overdue.
Yes.
And I think there's lots of different reasons around that as well.
I agree. And from our perspective, we're still seeing that there's still really strong demand in the market and probably supply hasn't caught up. So, if you look at things like the auction clearance rates, for example, Adelaide recorded the highest auction clearance rates amongst all the capital cities over the last quarter. And we're still seeing from our customer perspective that so many people have pre-approvals and they're still struggling to find the right property or get their offers accepted. So are you starting to see, what are you seeing on the demand and supply equations, and are you starting to see that balance out a bit more, or what are you seeing from that perspective?
Yeah, I think it will start to balance out. I think it's really early days because the interest rate only occurred yesterday.
Yes.
But I think the market has probably been starting to think about it and factor it into their thinking in the last couple of months, and now you've actually sort of officially had the rate rise. And there's talk that it might be the first of a couple of them, and that the rate rise might be at least 1% total by the time the RBA finish with it, maybe more. So I think with it, the tables will certainly turn. But I think, as I said, the values are in there and they will stay. It's just that the demand will start to flatten out a bit. And frankly, we'll just go to a more normalised market where, the supply and demand from buyers is more even, rather than all sort of buyer activity at this stage. And, the vendors are just have been seeing, the outcome of that.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point, because we have been living in a very abnormal market. We've had incredibly low historic interest rates. We've had surging property values, huge demand, low supply, so that's created the perfect storm, I guess. From what I'm seeing, I agree with you. I think that that it will eventually stabilise in Adelaide. We will get to a point where it sort of flattens out a little bit more, because we have to. It's unsustainable to continue this growth amount. But I'm still seeing that there's still a lot of growth in Adelaide over the coming months. Do you see that as well?
Well, I think for people that own property would probably like to think so.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I just don't know. I mean, I'll ask you a question. Why do you still see some ongoing growth in the market?
I think that it's the just the level of demand, I think, still outstrips the level of supply. I think the other factor that we're seeing from the finance perspective is that interstate investors are really interested in Adelaide, and there's a lot of interstate money being spent in Adelaide, not only on the resi side but also on the commercial space. So that's also boosting up demand as well. So I think, you know, where you've got a scenario where demand exceeds supply, then that is always going to create that property shift. I mean, definitely the growth is going to slow because the current growth is unsustainable, but from my perspective, the fundamentals still are there to say that, you know, for the remainder of this year, or, you know, we'll start to see that growth slowing, but there is still some growth to come.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think the property market, and it depends on the type of property, I should say. I think there's going to be sort of several factors going on at several sort of speeds in the market is sort of one term that's used, and the exclusive properties in the well-located areas, you know, within the sort of 5 to K sort of city fringe of Adelaide, on land, times title, freestanding, those sorts of properties, I think will still hold their value and the demand will be high. I can't actually see that changing at all, even with interest rates going up. I think those types of properties will certainly the demand will be high and therefore the growth. And as you say, one of the key issues still in the Adelaide market is the undersupply.
Yes.
And also with COVID, I think that's what's changed nationally. You know, the sentiment around Adelaide is that it is a lifestyle city. It is still got one of the most affordable housing values in Australia. I think it's sitting around, even though it's high, it's sitting around 660,000 now. I think along there with Tasmania, it's the second to lowest median house value in Australia. So there's lots of factors going on, and the fundamentals for Adelaide are still very good, and that's why we often talk about the media here and CoreLogic being one of the main people that supply information. Nothing wrong with what they say, but it's generally very focused on Eastern Seaboard.
Yeah.
But Adelaide is still very strong.
Yeah, and I think the other factor that I believe is going to drive future growth is just the strong growth that we've had in our rental yields. You know, the strong growth that we've had in our rents. You know, we have had extremely strong growth over the last 12 months. And I mean, even just over the March quarter, we had further growth of another, 3+% in that rent again. And so when we put that into perspective against the interest rate rise that we've just had, the interest rate rise might be 20 to 25 basis points. But when you compare that with the growth in the rental income, it still makes sense for people to be investing in Adelaide because the rental returns are still strong enough, and I think that's also driving a lot.
Price is still low.
That's right, and I'm that's driving a lot of interstate investment, but it's also driving local investment as well. And I believe that that's going to help to keep our market moving strong for at least for the next quarter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the thoughts we're having around with the sales part of our business and some of the conversations we're having with our clients is if you're thinking of selling and you're sort of a bit, should I do it now or should I wait? I think history would tell us that it's probably better to sort of start taking action potentially sooner rather than later.
Yes.
Because all the fundamentals that we're saying here are true and they will help and it'll keep values going. It'll be at the value that they've already got in their property, but also maybe a little bit of growth in that as well. But I think there's more risk moving forward. We've had one interest rate rise, there's probably going to be several more. And then I think what that does is a little bit dangerous because it changes sentiment. And then buyers start to think, hey, it's come back to my favour now. And you just lose, the frenzied nature of what has been happening in the market. So that's just something I would say to people,
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, and like if you don't... it's just a timing issue.
Yes.
It's like when you're buying the share market, you want to buy at the bottom and sell at the top. I think we're very much at the top.
Yes.
You can sort of see it starting to flatten and potentially curve down a bit with all these interest rate rises, and that will naturally just soften the market because that's what happens. So if you're thinking about selling, I'd probably do it sooner rather than later before the interest rates really start to bite and increase further.
And I guess, given that we have been in a declining interest rate environment for over a decade, and, so there are so many borrowers out there that have never experienced a rate increase.
Isn't that
you know,
crazy,
because,
yeah.
you know, over the last decade, interest rates have been going down. So it's going to be really interesting times ahead to see how the Australian people cope with these rate rises that are coming to bring us back into line with more normal interest rates, which, you know, the average long-term interest rate in Australia is more along the lines of 6-7%. So what we're experiencing now is, once again, historical lows, but we've become so used to them and so accustomed to these low rates. How are we going to go moving forward when rates go up a little bit? We always tell our clients to make sure that whatever they buy, they can afford it. Obviously, we do the calculations to help make sure that they can afford it as those rates are going up, but also for them to really think about, okay, what do we need to do if rates go up, and how are we going to make sure we can still afford our home, our investment property? Because these are important questions that people have to ask themselves.
Yeah, well, especially with the cost of living going up, and then in fact that's one of the issues in why interest rates are going up, because inflation's at 5.1%. So cost of petrol and food and everything's increasing. So that's almost like an interest rate rise in itself, to have inflation of, you know, key goods go up so much. So that's something else to factor into your budget.
Yep.
So I think the RBA will sort of increase rates, but they're not going to go crazy, because they know that there's a lot of people that might be caught a little bit short. So I think it'll be a balance, and it'll be a gentle sort of introduction of more expensive money, i.e. through interest rates, but they'll handle it pretty well, I reckon, hopefully.
And in terms of interest rate increases, obviously we've heard from the RBA yesterday, but we haven't had announcements yet from all of the banks as to what they're going to do. As they do make their announcements as to what increases they're going to apply and what date they're going to apply them, we'll make sure to keep you informed in our socials. So please have a look out for that, and you can contact us anytime if you want to check what your bank is doing, so that you know what your rates are going to be looking like moving forward. I think despite all the increase in interest rates and the inflation, everything we've talked about, Adelaide is still well positioned, and probably the best place to be buying now in Australia.
The best place to live, frankly.
And the best place to live, well, definitely no doubt about that. So thanks for your input today, Lockie, and we will see you. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next quarter when we come back to you with another quarterly property market update. Thanks, and have a great day. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.